This is the after party. Your hosts are the Great Order and No White Guild. The crown winner of last week is Squirrels, gifting a total of 10 Canadian dollars. Thank you and congratulations. In second place was our very own Tall Kevin, gifting $7. Thank you and congratulations as well. You can financially gift on Entropy, which I will have up in just a moment, where you can also watch the stream and ask and vote on questions. You can also financially gift at Cash App at 6%. Entropy, 15%. Cash App, 6%. Jared and I evenly share the financial gifts with our guests here on the after party. Now, today we have Alexander Illingworth on tap, and we're going to have Mr. George read us an introduction about the show today, and it's going to be very exciting. Mr. George and I are going to be learning alongside all of you. We're all going to be sitting sort of in the audience for Alexander today, and then Alexander will be able to introduce himself to this honorable community and tell us at the very outset of what he has to say, where folks can find him, and what he works on. But Mr. George, I pass it over to you.
All right, as Jason said, it's a little different today. So let me just get into this. We're going to start with a statement to set this up, just because we want to serve the material as best as we can. So I'm actually first going to start with a quote Alexander wrote. So we will give our guest the first word through his written word, published on Arctos Journal. And then, as I said, I'm going to give my own preamble to set up the show. So Alexander writes, "It is certainly true that the Western world has neglected investigation into the East for a long time, and perhaps unfairly, since it was the fruits of the fathers that resulted in a Christianity which suits the European imaginative mind far better than any other spiritual system that we know of, and it is this spirit, at once imaginative and moral, which has served Europe well, and contains the grains of truth that Europe has been able to cultivate and eventually offer the world as its legacy." End quote. So now, Alex, that is a heck of a statement, and we're going to use that as a frame for this conversation. As I said, seeing as how this is an ambitious topic for one stream, and one rife with pitfalls and the ability to elicit strong emotions, I'm going to take several minutes to read some reflections I have, hopefully for the sake of clarity, because of the pursuit of truth is impossible to separate from the personal, and to hopefully help make this the most edifying show it can be for all of us here and all of you listening. So to avoid confusion or maybe some unnecessary questions later, I please do ask for your undivided attention, as this is going to take a little time to read, but I believe it is crucial. As I said, it's a different kind of a tap today, and we're very excited for that. Of course, as Jason and I always state, in the immediate present circumstances, the main thing peoples of European descent must keep in mind is our well-being, of course, and no matter your belief, that ethos is what guides our work and the growing community here. Now, my considerations, I, of course, only speak for myself here. So firstly, I've learned enough about this topic to acknowledge that Christianity, as many of us know it today, especially via Protestantism and Roman Catholicism, has been infiltrated by foundations and organizations who have used enormous influence and money to do things like place people in positions of leadership in seminaries, things like that, and have steered much of the church's workings in globalist and anti-white directions. And this goes back centuries in some regards. This is well documented if you'd like to do your own research. Simply looking at the current forms to then critique Christianity as a whole would be like citing Wicca or something like that to someone who seriously adheres to European folkish spirituality. So we do ask our community to engage in a high level of discourse here, not internet meme levels of argumentation, please. The fact that actual Christianity seems to have all the right enemies and be in the crosshairs of those who do promote that notion that we've, quote, evolved past needing divinity and want a technocratic world where everything is relative, bereft of any inherent meaning or morality, should give us all great pause. The fact that Christianity sprung from the tradition of another people, particularly one who is known to have a significant portion of their influential members hold a certain animus towards and work to undermine our own, is a serious consideration, and that will be brought up today. However, my own reflections on that topic, through those, I can concede that very animus and seemingly perpetual tension between our two peoples could itself be a very potent testimony to Christianity being the most fundamental choice one can make. In my own investigations of Eastern Orthodoxy, I've been struck by several things I'll mention below. And note, it's been about roughly 6 weeks I've researched and opened myself up to this more. Up until this summer, I've only had the experience in the thought and churches of Roman Catholicism and some American Protestantism. I've also been somewhat of a method actor for this TAP episode. In addition to doing a lot of research, I've gotten an Orthodox book of prayers, I've done some daily prayers, and I've attended my first Orthodox Sunday liturgy a few weeks ago. I've also naturally been in a period of somewhat of asceticism for much of this summer, spending significant amounts of time alone, often fasting. I know Orthodoxy particularly emphasizes the experiential and acts of purification in order to best be prepared to receive the nudges of the Spirit. So that all bodes well for earnestly being open to all of this. The main aspect that struck me about Orthodoxy, and this is huge in its implications, and again, Orthodoxy has some distinctions from Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. So we're talking today about Eastern Orthodoxy, not Christianity in general. Orthodoxy, what struck me is the avoidance in large part of dialectics, of either or dichotomies, and instead it often taking an approach that looks to harmonize concepts and really our experiences. The Orthodox model, from what I see, is not one of dualities causing perpetual conflicts that then lead to quote-unquote progress and revolutions, but rather stable triads formed from the synergy of two opposites that we seek to harmonize with. For example, there's no tension between masculine and feminine, local and universal, change and stasis, physical and non-physical, God as personal and God as transcendent, essences and forms. That's why God has to be personal, or we lose distinction and meaning. Details in the whole, civic and religious spheres of society, and the logical and the mystical. The list can go on, but that last point about the logical and the mystical especially struck me, how Orthodoxy speaks of the nous as a third faculty that opens more fully when the heart and the mind are balanced. And this nous faculty is how we experience what we can of God. Note, we may have elsewhere heard Greek terms like nous and logos, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Orthodoxy has the same conception of these terms as certain Greek philosophers who also use those same terms. So please just keep that in mind. Orthodoxy's conception of the resurrection, salvation, and the afterlife is also unique and compelling from what I've researched. This also seems to me related to what they call ancestral sin. Interesting, as original sin is not a term they use. Ancestral sin is more like you'll have to deal with the weaknesses that pass through your family line, the strengths, the weaknesses. I think we all can acknowledge that to some degree. Briefly, I'll mention two telling things about the tricky topic of salvation that left an impression on me. One is that, from what I gather, again, just me gathering this, but Alexander said it sounds like I'm on the right track because he took a look at this. One is that only God knows the heart of a man. God will always reveal himself in some way, and no other person is in a position to assume what's gone on in the life of another. Thus, Orthodoxy eliminates silly discussions about whether some kid in an obscure village who'd never heard of Jesus is quote-unquote saved. It altogether sees salvation as an eternal process, not a transaction where you make one statement of faith and then you're in, etc. Flowing from that, the second thing that strikes me is this. Our choice to move towards God's grace being offered to all and being an eternal process means that in the afterlife, the state of experiencing the waters of heaven, what might be called waters of life, which might be called heaven, or the rivers of fire, which might be called hell or Hades, is the same thing. All will ultimately be in the presence of God, but those who love God will love it, and those who hate God will hate it. To me, this is a profound example of Orthodoxy's harmonization of the practical and the mystical. Finally, for now, I'll say that the harmonious triality instead of duality approach, of course, is reflected in the triune God being the grounding structure, and this concept resolves any unnecessary conflicts between the one and the many. For listeners in our community, the most relevant effect of this would be the harmony one can experience as simultaneously being part of the wide world, even one united under a basic truth and one God for all peoples, as this faith posits, while still maintaining, celebrating, and living out one's ethnoculture, your particular people's story, something I talk about all the time. All of what I'm mentioning meshes very well with my own reflections, my critiques of modernity, how all manner of things and modes of thinking are too partitioned and specialized now, but in some ways that's a perennial problem. And my foundational essays published 3 years ago on my website when I started, the last of which dealt a lot with my own musings on how it's not so easy to dismiss Christian love as toothless. I may be known for doing presentations on and advocating for our European ethnocultures, but I also mention the above to demonstrate that from the get-go, I've always tried to get the most robust understanding of Christianity and give it its due on its terms instead of just my own assumptions. While I'm still not a believer today, I remain, as I have since childhood, actively open to the highest, the purest, and the true. And I was a believer at times when younger, I guess most notably in my teenage years. In today's discussion, we will touch on both the practical and theological. Obviously, this one stream is well beyond the scope of a full theological exposition, but it would be impossible to assess orthodoxy's practical uses and explore why it might be better situated to offer alternative ways out of modernity and attacks against our peoples without discussing the theological as well. And in the spirit of orthodoxy's emphasis on harmony, it wouldn't make sense to cause an unnecessary cleft there anyway. To keep this all somewhat focused, we will assume a religious frame. We don't need to throw something else into the mix and make this more complicated by having to justify a god or divinity to begin with. So we will not factor in atheistic arguments. Please keep that in mind when you submit your questions. Also, please keep in mind, as I said, we're not discussing Christianity as a whole. We're here to learn from Alexander on a topic Jason and I don't know much about, which I think is also true for most of you listening. And that, of course, is Eastern Orthodoxy, something distinct from Roman Catholicism and all forms of Protestantism. And one more small point for clarity. Sometimes there's a little fuzziness between the terms West and East. In the past on this show, we have used the term West to broadly encapsulate all peoples of European descent. I think we know that, white peoples. On today's show, because of historic delineations, when we or our guest says East, it will generally mean Greece, Eastern Europe, Russia, places like that where Orthodoxy flourished and remains. Politically, this area constitutes much of what was the Byzantine Empire or Eastern Roman Empire, which survived and thrived for almost another millennium after the fall of Western Rome in the year 476 AD, when the last emperor in Italy was deposed. In religious terms, Eastern Orthodoxy is contrasted to Roman Catholicism, alternatively called the Latin Rite or the Western Rite, and of course, as mentioned, the later Protestant splits with that church. Note that for the first 1,000 years of the church, it was all technically the same church until the East-West church schism in the year 1054, though there were tensions long prior to that. So now that I've said my piece, Alexander, welcome to the after party. And please introduce yourself and begin by providing your opening statement on what exactly Eastern Orthodoxy is.
Well, thank you very much, Jared, for your statement and for your introductions. I'm very grateful to be with you, both of you today, and to be with your audience. And I hope I can be of some use. I hope I can do some justice to this topic and provide some education for you all. And I will try to assume that most of you are starting with very little. So if I mention something that some of you already know, please don't be offended. I'm just working with the best that I can. As for myself, I am Alexander Illingworth. I have written a book which is published on Archetype Media, Political Justice, a Traditionalist Conservative Case for an Alternative Society, published back in 2018. If you want to find out a bit more about that, you can go on the Archetype Media website and find that book. And you can also find some of my articles that I've written for the Archetype Journal over the years on there as well. And that's where you'll find most of my work at the moment. I recently completed my university thesis on Nikolai Berdyaev, the Russian existentialist philosopher. And so at the moment, I've mostly been spending my time thinking about that. And it's only recently that I've had time to focus on other projects as well. So actually, this comes at an opportune moment for me. As for what Eastern Orthodoxy is, you've already given a very good overview of some basic ideas about it and what distinguishes it from perhaps the philosophical underpinnings and traditions of other forms of Christianity that people might be familiar with. I would say, if I had to sum it up briefly, it would be a form of Christianity or a denomination of Christianity which claims to be the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church founded by Christ. It is mostly focused on Eastern Europe in the countries. It's mostly followed in Greece, Russia, Belarus, Bulgaria, and so on, Romania. It also has minority followings in the Middle East as a result of the historical situations there, the remnants after the conquest of Islam, and so on. And what distinguishes it from, say, Roman Catholicism and Protestantism is that it derives its theology primarily from the works of the Greek fathers. And by the Greek fathers, I don't necessarily mean all ethnic Greeks, although most of them were ethnic Greeks. I mean the fathers of the church, the priests and bishops of the early millennia of Christianity, who wrote in Greek as their primary language. There are also church fathers who are frequently quoted in the Orthodox tradition who were not Greek speakers or writers. There's, for example, Ambrose of Milan, I see quoted a lot, who was a Latin father, a pre-schism Latin father. And there are others as well who are venerated in the Orthodox tradition who are not from the East. And so it can be confusing. And it is something of a misnomer in the true sense, because theologically it is simply considers itself to be the Orthodox Church with a set of doctrines derived from essentially the first millennium of Christianity. Its doctrines are derived from the first 7 ecumenical councils, the first 7 meetings of Christian bishops from across what was then the Christian world in various locations across Europe, but mostly located in the east of the old Roman world. And these councils agreed on various doctrines, such as the Holy Trinity and the use of iconography in worship, and so on. And whilst these councils are considered to have elucidated true doctrines, they were only generally considered to have elucidated doctrines in clear dogmatic forms, but these dogmas were considered to be representations of ideas that had been around since earlier centuries before these councils met. And indeed, I would say that one of Orthodoxy's main theological arguments is to point towards the early fathers and early Christians whose records we have, and to try and trace continuity back through the ages to the apostolic fathers, the disciples of the apostles who were the disciples of Christ. And that, in a nutshell, is what it is. I'm sure we'll get into the detail of various aspects of it, because it's hard to sum up, really. So for now, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I know some people, myself included, before I did more research, might have thought, well, guys just deciding things at councils, it was a majority vote. No, that's too easy an argument. I'm sorry. When you really look into this, you see that what they were doing was they were sussing out, if you start from this faulty premise, it might sound good at first, but when you knock down that first domino and then idea A, idea B follows from that, idea C follows from that, etc., then you end up with a relativistic universe. Some of these church fathers were brilliant men. You cannot dismiss this stuff by just saying, oh, it's superstition for people that aren't intelligent. There are geniuses in the Christian tradition. I don't think I have to tell us that. I am not even on the formal part of it yet, but this is the one church father I've been reading so far. I'm just on the introduction, St. Maximus the Confessor, Cosmic Mystery of Jesus Christ, but very interesting, very heavy stuff. And again, some of these guys were so astute, they said centuries before certain poison fruits of a bad idea would take form, they would say, no, if you do this heresy, it's going to lead to a relativistic philosophy. It's going to lead to an atheistic philosophy, like a free-for-all. A lot of these guys actually saw some of our modern ills coming, which gives me great pause, and again, is what allowed me to so seriously investigate this summer. But I'll get right to the second question. And today's show, I'm just going to read the questions just right off of my computer here, because again, we need to be very precise with this kind of show and this kind of topic. But I think this is the one that Chad is probably the most interested in. So we'll start with the most poignant and urgent matter, and then we'll use that to get deeper under the iceberg. But my second question is this, Alexander. Please provide an overview of how, even though, like any form of Christianity, Orthodoxy makes universal truth and moral claims and posits one God for all humanity, it maintains national churches and furthermore appears to be best contending with modernity's ills and the anti-white poisons infesting many European peoples. Alexander.
So the existence of national churches is actually can be derived from the church's teachings regarding what it means to be a nation. So this can be traced back to the Tower of Babel, the story of the Tower of Babel in the Bible, the dispersion of mankind. But however one reads that, the fundamental point is that nationhood and the differences between people was not an accident. It was something that was actually ordained and instituted by God himself as part of essentially a desire to make the world diverse in the true sense, to make it interesting, to have many flowers in the meadow, so to speak. But now, of course, as you mentioned, Christianity is a universalizing religion. It teaches that everyone, regardless of every human being, that is, not everything, but every human being can be saved. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that we all have to adopt some kind of monoculture? No, because at heart, Christian spirituality, Orthodox Christian spirituality, is not necessarily to do with culture in the sense that what you do to be saved is something actually quite on a different level to what one sees. So what that means is that actually culture is something which can be sanctified and some can be set apart and used for the good. So, for example, one might find that the people in Russia say the same creed as the people in Greece, but the Russians have their own traditions and the Greeks have their own traditions and the Copts have their own traditions and so on, because actually these cultural customs, provided that there's nothing in them which directly contradicts dogma, can be retained and can be used in the church. Furthermore, any kind of idea of destroying a nation or reducing it somehow would be considered to be sinful, because it would be considered to be an act of rebellion against God. So to say that, for example, a country, let's say Russia, just because I've mentioned it before, could not exist because it has to become something else, it has to become Christian, is a complete misunderstanding of how the Orthodox see salvation working through a people. One can speak of Christian Russia, Holy Russia, for example, but this refers to both Christianity and Russia together in harmony. It doesn't refer to the destruction of one or the other. So this immediately sets things apart from maybe certain trends one sees in Western theological seminaries, where Christianity is used as essentially an excuse to try and create a universal culture of some description. Of course, Jesus said very little about culture in reality. And Jesus, of course, is not, although in some sense one might say that Jesus is the source of all authority in the Orthodox Church, the words of Jesus in the Bible are not the only sources of authority. Our tradition does not limit knowledge of God to just scriptures, which is one fundamental difference again with, say, maybe forms of Protestantism that people would be familiar with, where the Bible is taken to be absolute in all things. There are other sources of revelation which Orthodox acknowledge. One of these things is the saints, and the saints are recognized to belong to different nations, and each nation venerates its own saints in its own way, and I'll touch more on that later, so I'll save that for now. Orthodoxy maintains, to a great degree, the teachings of the first millennium of Christianity as its dogma. Those teachings of the ecumenical councils that I mentioned are retained, and they have not been changed in any sense, in a dogmatic sense, since the last ecumenical council was held in the 8th century. So this means that many of these ethical questions, especially that people face today, have already been answered by the ecumenical councils. I can think, for example, of one of the spiritual ailments that afflicts modern man, and by modern man I do actually, in fact, let's say we speak specifically about men in the West, many of whom I know from conversations that I've had struggle with all kinds of different spiritual and physical ailments. There is the constant bombardment of pornography, self-abuse, loneliness, all these different forms of evil that distract people and which drag them down and affects their personal well-being, and which frankly leads to destruction. This is not just an individual affliction that people face, it's also something which goes beyond the individual and affects wider society. Orthodoxy grounds the individual in a lifestyle of repentance, which is at once an individual thing and a communal thing. It is individual because we have to seek, in seeking repentance, we seek, in the Greek term for repentance, I should point out, is metanoia, which means literally a change of the nous, a turning around of the nous, a change of mind, in a sense, an effort to change one's perspective and to try not just not to do a sin again, but to change one's whole perspective on everything from day-to-day life to the entire universe. And so it is a reorienting power that reorients us towards certain virtues, which are entirely lacking in the modern world.
Yes, as we know all too well. You said metanoia was another word for, was it redemption
Repentance.
or something else? Repentance. I thought I wrote that down wrong. Yes, I'm a little familiar with some of that as well. And again, folks, this is why I was pretty compelled. It sounds a little less like, and not that you're not held to high standards and a high account, but a little bit less like this whole, where you're kind of, I know why some people would look down on this word repentance. I'll just leave it at that for now. We're going to talk more about that later. I still have some challenges with that, and something I want to ask Alexander about later. But it does have a little bit of a different feel than some of the more modern forms of Christianity we know, with you're kind of born a sinner, born dirty, and people think to themselves that aren't Christian, like, that just sounds so like guilt-ridden. And Orthodoxy has a much more, I think, sane, rational way of approaching this, because I can certainly contend the world's not perfect. I'm not perfect. Nothing's perfect. They see, we'll get back to this, but from what I've heard, Alexander, your tradition sees sin not as infraction, like you did something wrong and you owe a debt, and only, Jesus paid your debt. So as much as infection, like the world is beautiful, it's of God's creation, but the world is still imperfect because of the fall. You really can't talk about the theology of this without the fall. And we were in a different state, as this theology talks about, and we're going to be restored to that pre-fall state. And no one really knows what it's like. And that's getting a little more mystical. But all that to say,
You're correct. You are correct, though. And one thing I would add is that one doesn't find the theology, say, of penal substitution, the idea that Christ has taken on a punishment on your behalf. Instead, in Orthodoxy, the crucifixion doesn't have as much of a significance. Obviously, it's significant, but it doesn't have as much of a significance in terms of salvation as it does in, say, Protestant theology, which many people will be thinking of when they think of salvation in Christianity. If anything, the crucifixion in Orthodox theology is a means to an end. And what matters in Orthodox theology is the resurrection, because this implies a renewal of the person, of the human person, and an ascension to divinity of the human person.
Yes, the way that I understood it, and again, we have to get to questions because we're getting into like heavy theological territory, and I'm a newbie here. I'm a newbie here, so I say that with humility, but that in this belief system, what it was is that if human nature and the world, it has this break in it because of the fall. Christ joins as a part of the Godhead, the triune. All are the same, the Father, Son, Spirit. One is not dominant over the other. But anyway, Christ is the form that joins with human nature as such. That's why when I said in my introduction, this salvation is offered to all people, because it's joining God and human nature with the human nature as such. So it's like if you picture like water in a glass, I just thought of this metaphor, Alexander. Tell me if this makes any sense. Water in a glass, clear, beautiful water, but something gets in it to dilute the water a little bit. Some toxins or dirt gets into it. It's almost like Jesus was the dropper, where you took something and you dropped in this pure, clean essence that then restores the water back to its pure, drinkable, beautiful form. It's something like that in joining our natures. Would that be accurate?
It's much like that. Yes, that's a good analogy.
All right. Glad I'm on track there. But let's get to this next question. Again, I'm just going to read this as is. Alexander, you may have already answered some of this in your previous statement about European peoples and how nationhood and peoplehood is certainly not mutually exclusive. But I'm going to go on and read it anyway. If we need to be quick here, we have certainly much more to get to. But having said that, the third question: Orthodoxy presents iconography, its depiction of Christ and the saints, as a tool for theological learning and portals for personal religious experience. This is altogether different from Western European religious art. Even the Eastern churches are domed and altars set up to reflect continuity with the temples of ancient Israel. I know that'll raise a few eyebrows. We will get to that in the next question. But keeping with iconography, while these forms have theological meaning and thus must remain in any Orthodox church and practice, they're not merely a matter of taste. Aesthetics still call to people subconsciously, and to put it crudely, aesthetics sell something. Even though we seek solidarity in our common struggle, European peoples are incredibly diverse. For example, many have detailed how original Christian conversion had to be approached differently in Northern Europe than the Mediterranean. How do you factor these realities into presenting a case for orthodoxy that could be compelling to all of the various European peoples? Personally, I'm compelled by the theology, but a good deal of the aesthetics still feel foreign to me, and I do myself have some Slavic heritage, albeit very Western Slavic. But Alexander.
So the architectural and aesthetic style element of it is largely a result of historical accident. It's because of the concentration of these churches in the Eastern world, in Greece and the Byzantine world, which essentially this was the aesthetic of the Byzantine world. And the Russians took that on when they were converted in, I think it was the 9th century, and they have their own variations on that, and they have their own unique styles. But still, it can feel a little alien to people from Western European backgrounds when they come to it for the first time. I know for myself personally, for example, I find the Russian style of liturgical music to be much more palatable to my ear, because the Russians use a Western style form of harmonized music, whereas the Greeks use it's Byzantine music, right? It's a melody sung atop a drone, but it can sound quite Arabic to a Western ear. It can sound foreign because we're not used to it. So again, that's an example of essentially culture, something that is malleable, that's not dogmatic. So you mentioned icons, and you're right that these are dogmatic. And they are important that there is continuity in iconography, because part of the point of iconography is that it reminds us that the saints, and I'd probably say most importantly, Christ, was a historical person who existed at a specific point in time, and who looked a certain way and existed in a certain way, and he was a specific person. He wasn't a universal person in his flesh. But nevertheless, there are variations from iconographer to iconographer, and one doesn't find iconography to be something strictly Eastern. You can go to a medieval English church down the road from where I live, for example, and find wall paintings, frescoes of essentially early medieval iconography that's not too dissimilar to some of the styles of iconography one finds in the East.
Just to get something in, excuse me, Alexander, I should say, I apologize. I should have sent Jason, I should have sent you an example of this iconography. Maybe we can get something in the chat, a link. It's that very flat look. That's why I said it's different than Western art. It's not the Western Renaissance, very dramatic scenes. It's very flat. And there's a theological reason, because you're not supposed to project too much into it. You're supposed to get the truth of what's coming through. Like I said, it's a portal. And for me, not that this is about me personally, I'm fine with the icons. It was more of other things, like the way the priests dress with those flat top hats and the domes, the more Eastern stuff. Not all of Eastern Europe feels, certainly not all of it, even Greece doesn't feel foreign to me. But there were enough elements to mention it. But just for my own point of clarification, the actual iconography, like when I went to the liturgy, I mentioned I went to an Orthodox liturgy a few weeks ago. Actually, I like some of the iconography, the illustrations.
Well, the flat top hats are from the Byzantine court. That's where that comes from. But no, the actual, if that's what is sort of that's what you're sort of is in the back of your mind when you see these things, you'll be pleased to know that actually Orthodoxy is not limited to that. There is a movement. It's still quite small, but it does exist canonically, and it is, I should think, growing from what I've been told by various priests who are part of it, called the Orthodox Western Rite. And essentially, the Western Rite is an attempt to revive the pre-schism liturgies, aesthetics, and so on of the Latin Rite. So the priests dress in slightly more familiar vestments. The liturgy is called the Mass, and so on. But you do not have the theological beliefs that came after the schism. And the parts of the liturgy that were developed after the schism have been essentially revised and removed or adapted for the Orthodox use. So there are certain theological elements that have been, certain prayers have been added to the Tridentine Mass, for example, to make it more acceptable to an Orthodox reader. But this has actually yielded a great deal of fruit, because I'll take the example of what's happened here. There was a priest who recently discovered a form of the Eucharistic liturgy which was practiced by the Anglo-Saxon Church from I think at least the 7th, if not maybe the 8th century onwards. And he recently published an edition of it, and he's been using it, and he's been blessed to use this ritual in his day-to-day monastic life. And so it has led to this rediscovery of a heritage, which maybe can account for what you're talking about. Maybe this is what some people would be looking for. They would be looking for a church of the Western Rite, which has the Orthodox theology, but which retains liturgical and aesthetic customs, which maybe are more familiar, more comfortable, perhaps.
Right. Yeah. And I know it's not all about just kowtowing to someone's tastes. We know that a lot of churches have kowtowed to modernity, and I've heard you speak on this, and I feel very much the same, that it takes away that sense of the sacred, where you have church services where it's just basically a speech and then a rock band plays. That I want to be able to step outside of modernity when I go into a church. I want something more sanctified. And as I said, I've heard you say the same thing, but I have heard other speakers and thinkers from the Orthodox tradition say, and this was the spirit of my question, that there are certain elements of the aesthetics and the structures, maybe even certain of the building structures, as I mentioned, the altar and the dome reflecting a continuation with temple life, the temple life of ancient Israel, there are certain things that can't be changed because there's theology actually tied to the forms. So, for example, to your knowledge, in a hypothetical future where Eastern Orthodoxy gained ascendancy in Germany or in England, would they have to build new buildings, or could they do these rites and not lose any of the Eastern Orthodox theology in the cathedrals that we love, whose aesthetics we love? In the Cathedral of Cologne, Jason and I both love the cathedral in Cologne, Germany. I've actually visited myself. What do you say to that kind of thing?
You could, especially, particularly with the Western Rite, but not necessarily even with the Western Rite, even with the Eastern Rite, that you could absolutely use those buildings, because those buildings are actually built on a very similar principle. The interior design of these buildings points towards temple worship as well. Sure, they don't have domes, but you don't need a dome. The dome is an Eastern thing which is designed to recall heaven, but so does the huge steeple towers of European cathedrals. It's the same idea, reaching up towards heaven in worship. So absolutely not. In fact, I came back from a service today which was in the Byzantine Rite, but which was held in an English medieval church. There's nothing theologically wrong with celebrating in that building.
Speaks perfectly to the question, and you did it today. Very impressive. If you have something else to add, please. If not, I can get on to the next point.
I think that's everything for that.
All right. So this kind of continues from what we were saying, and I know some of our listeners will be wondering about this. Given the above, we must now hear your case for how, in a time of extreme anti-Whiteism in many of our countries, we can countenance a religion that tells us the most important and consequential event in human history happened in a non-European land, telling our children stories of prophets and sages who often have non-European names, living in places with foreign-sounding names, etc. And more poignantly, that even if the theological argument that Jesus as God is not really of any one human ethnicity, the story still clearly comes from the people who are most commonly thought to be our main rivals, that the liturgy is a continuation of synagogue and temple tradition, as we just said, and that unlike certain Christian sects, from what I've seen, Orthodoxy, except maybe for some American iterations and teachers suffering from those infiltrations I mentioned before of modernity and relativism, but from what I understand, the true Orthodox Church teaches that the God of the Old Testament is indeed the God of the New Testament. It's the same God. It has to be one Bible. Old Testament has typologies or foreshadowings of Christ throughout. So the Old Testament is absolutely essential. It's not enough in Orthodoxy to say, well, Jesus fulfilled the law, therefore we don't need the Old Testament anymore and things like that. And Alexander, of course, Jason and I would never want to put words in your mouth, but please do bear this in mind. Like the above question regarding aesthetics, we feel it would be best for our understanding and what we assess to be the understanding of our listeners. It would be best to address this in a manner that it is more of a prerequisite or foundation prior to presenting a truth claims argument. Because we know you could say, it doesn't matter where it came from if it's true. It could have come from Tahiti. If it's true, it's true. I get that. And we're not really, I don't know if that's really the most useful conversation to have in the time we have you for. So for example, I have a hypothetical for you. How would you approach a man who reads the Eddas, the Norse Eddas, for spiritual inspiration, gives his children old Germanic names, that he should even care to listen to your truth claims argument, given the fact he'd no doubt bristle at all the things I mentioned above, or that at most he sees Christianity as a religion that flourished in the deracinated cities of the Greek and Roman empires, but is antithetical to what he sees as his more earthly Northern European kin. How would you ease this man's concerns that all of these things are intrinsically dangerous to the health and continuation of his people before he'd even be able to consider a truth claims argument? Alexander.
Okay, so actually I want to answer your question with a question, a rhetorical question, so I don't, but you can try and answer it if you like, but I don't expect you to, because this is more for effect, I suppose, which is, you say that this tradition, this truth claim, comes from a people who are considered to be antagonistic towards us. But I'm going to ask you a question, which is, does it? And that might surprise people, and what I'm about to say might surprise people, and they might not have heard this before. Some might have done, some might already know about it, but the people in question that you're talking about quite arguably have very little to do with the people of Israel of the Old Testament, because I'm just thinking of the best way to frame this. Well, the people of Israel were an agglomeration of different tribes people, as I'm sure many people already know. There are numerous tribes. There's the tribe of Manasseh, the tribe of Judah, the tribe of Benjamin, and so on. And only one of those tribes, the tribe of Judah, so it supposedly persists to this day. And okay, perhaps it does, but it exists in a highly diluted and scattered form, and it is not. It doesn't really resemble. It doesn't retain the practices, the religious practices, in absolute sense of the historical Hebrews or people of Israel, whatever you want to call them. Those practices were very specific. As you say, temple worship, based around the law of Moses and so on. Sure, the law of Moses is the foundation of the Old Testament. It's the foundation of the old covenant with the people of Israel that God, we are told, made with them. But this is a story about a nation which doesn't exist because it doesn't need to exist anymore. Because it has essentially, the theological teaching is that it has been expanded since. And if you read the Old Testament in a serious way, you will find that basically all of the prophets, the message they're putting across is that God entrusted his truth to the people of Israel, and then it was the people who were not the people of Israel were going to be included eventually. And that's a prophecy that they were given, and you either take it at face value or you do not, essentially based on presuppositional beliefs. So I understand that that's something which people either accept or they don't. So how are we going to reconcile this with people who, at least at the face of it, as you say, would appear to be living in a completely different world? Let's say the North Germanic people, the Saxons and the Angles and the Northmen and so on. How are they to relate to this? Well, actually, I have quite a good answer for you, and the reason why is because when these people were converted to Christianity originally, they were converted to a form of Christianity which was not dissimilar to Orthodoxy, because they were converted by the churchmen who were part of the one church that existed at that time. And I would like to recommend a book to you and to your audience, if you haven't read it already, The Ecclesiastical History of the English People by the Venerable Bede, who was an Anglo-Saxon monk and priest living in the 8th century AD, who actually was the first writer to coin the term English. He takes essentially what were different tribes of Germanic people living in the British Isles in his own time, and he creates the English nation because he saw them as united by one language and also one faith. So it also provides many insights into what sort of faith that these people had, and it provides many insights into how they might have been converted. It's quite difficult to completely reconstruct a model of how the transition from Germanic paganism to Germanic Christianity actually took place, because the only writings we have are retrospective reflections of Christian writers, really. And paganism itself is not that well documented, especially Germanic paganism. So when it comes to understanding how someone who reads the poetic Eddas or the prose Eddas to his children is going to react to this, I think actually he can find a lot of help in that book and in books like that, because there is absolutely no reason why you cannot continue to read the poetic Eddas to your children and also be an Orthodox Christian. There is absolutely no reason why you cannot name your child Thor and still be an Orthodox Christian. And the reason why I say that is because of two reasons. First of all, there's historical precedent to it. If we look at many of the Anglo-Saxon saints and Anglo-Saxon churchmen, they did not adopt the custom, although they became Christian, they did not adopt the custom of taking on biblical names. Some of them did take on biblical patrons as patron saints, and they had it as like a sort of middle name. But as their personal names, they did not change them. And that's why you see saints in the English tradition, such as Saint Cuthbert, whose name comes from the Old English Cuthbert, which means widely renowned. Or, I don't know, let's take, for example, Saint Wilfrid, or Saint Hilda, or any of these individuals who retained Germanic names and yet were Christians. Or who, and the reason why is because, for example, look at someone like King Alfred the Great. His name in Old English, Alfred, means elf ruler.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he's also sometimes called the English David, the King David from the Bible, because of his piety and because of his legal reforms. So how can he have a name like that? Well, because he wasn't given the name because his parents thought that he was going to bow down and worship demons or something, or because they valued the old gods as gods. He was named that because it was their tradition. He was named that because it connected the people of Old England to their heritage, and because these things were not actually lost in the transition to Christianity. They were just reimagined, or perhaps reimagined is probably the wrong word, because it implies that something that was true was changed. It was reinterpreted based on a new truth that they had encountered. So, for example, the maypole. You I think mentioned this to me previously in private, Jared, talking about dancing around the maypole. You see, dancing around the maypole had like an extra bar put across it after the Christian conversion, and so the maypole becomes a cross. And this is an example of essentially what is called baptizing.
We're going to get more into that in the next question. Absolutely, yeah. We're going to develop this more. While we're on this, though, I want to make sure where you started. You gave us something very juicy and interesting about the rethinking the culture and peoples this comes from. Also, we should say, and well, I'll give you a moment to say if you want about this, that if one were to take this cosmic view and say, well, where does the European man see himself in this? If you're like a Martian looking down on the history of Earth, we know that Christianity went into Asia. We know that it went into Africa. First of all, I will contend, and again, I speak as someone who's not a believer, that if God had to intercede in human affairs once, that location was a pretty good location. That you couldn't really pick a better location to disseminate to most of the corners of where cultures and civilizations were. So no one's saying it's exclusively European. Obviously, there were church fathers in North Africa. It went to parts of Asia. Different peoples have different parts of the Christian story. But the European genius that we celebrate here on this show and our community, and our ability to spread not only ideas, but eventually the technology. We're the people that created the technology where all of these ideas can proliferate around the world. We would be a big part of that story, I would contend. And even the fact that for all of its faults, the Greek and Roman empires were part of what incubated, I don't know if that's the best word, but Christianity needed that and needed to come in a time of European empire to spread the way it did. You have anything to say about that angle of seeing ourselves in this story?
Well, there's certainly a providential aspect to that. There are far better theologians than me who will be able to talk to you about the prophecy of Daniel and seeing how Daniel may have prophesied about the Roman Empire and its usefulness.
I've heard of that.
I'm not an expert at that, so I can't tell you too much, but I will say that it's out there if you want to try and look it up. What I'll also say is that it doesn't appear to me to be that the conversion of the Roman Empire took place kind of cynically and by chance. It's this very interesting time period. Obviously, I can't go into detail about it now because that could be a whole stream in itself. But what I will say is the explosion of Christianity in Europe seems to have appealed on the one hand very successfully to certain European intellectual cultures, but on the other hand, it completely transformed those intellectual cultures. And I heard one priest once said to me, it was the Greeks who got us into the intellectual mess, and the Greeks have given us the means to get us out of it as well, because the Greek fathers on the one hand, they used the intellectual traditions that they had already, but they
of their
really
philosophy,
interpreted them, yes, in a very particular way that one has to be careful about when one talks about it, because there's a lot of sloppiness that when people talk about the Hellenization of Christianity, for example, it's not as big a deal as people think, because the Greek fathers, in some cases, really rebuked the Greek philosophers. On the other hand, they did use a lot of ideas from the Greek philosophers.
Right. The way I've heard it explained is... Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. As I mentioned, it doesn't stop with the Greek fathers. You go further west, you see some of the earliest... another early father is Irenaeus of Lyon, or Lugdunum, the town in Roman Gaul. And the Venerable Bede, as I mentioned, the author of the Ecclesiastical History, was a Germanic person. He was an Anglo-Saxon man, and he was also he's also an Orthodox saint. You can venerate him, you can pray to him. Saint Cuthbert, again, Saint, all these different people who didn't have basically anything to do with I don't know, Elijah or something, a completely different world to Elijah, nevertheless enter the tradition and become part of our world. And even if you're not convinced by Christianity and you decide that you want nothing to do with it, you can't escape the fact that part of our tradition are these men and women who adopted this and became part of our story.
The juicy tidbit I was first getting at before I took a bit of a tangent and asked you about how European peoples could see themselves in that story, and thank you for your answer on that, was you mentioned this thing about the tribes, and Judah's the only one that survived, and it might not be quite what we think when we hear these certain ideas thrown around in our circles today. Do you have before we get on to the next questions, a quick reference, a book recommendation where we can learn more if we want to about what you're talking about there exactly? Because I don't want to leave that hanging. That sounds pretty fascinating.
If anyone wants to write to me with recommendations, I think my email is in the description, and I'll do my best to forward on what I can. There is a great website run by a gentleman, I forget his name, but the website's name is Apologia Pro Orthodoxa, and he is a biblical scholar. He's studied the scriptures in far greater detail than I ever would, and he has numerous articles about the history of the 12 tribes of Israel, amongst many other topics about, many challenging things as well as many interesting things. And you can go and read his website, and you can find an article there. I will see if I can find a link and see if I can get it to you. But if anyone wants me to try, and if anyone wants me to send that to them, they can write to me, and I'll try my best to get it to them, as well as anything else that I can remember. Otherwise, you can just look at the Bible itself and see that there was a definite change, and you can see, for example, that after the exile to Babylon, after Jerusalem was destroyed and the people of Israel were taken away to different parts of the world, for the first time, the tribes actually mostly dispersed then. The Samaritans, for example, are the remnants of 2 different tribes, and there are only a couple of hundred of them left living today, and they have nothing really to do with any of the other, to do with the tribe of Judah as it stands.
We do have a couple of more meaty questions to get to, and then of course Jason will present us any questions the chat has. So we still have some ahead of us. I don't want to get off too much, but since we're talking about this, I know there are some people who will want me to ask you this. And Alexander, forgive me if you could be brief with this. What do you think of this idea that actually a lot of these peoples of the Bible, to put another fold into this topic that we're chewing over right now, were actually us more than we're realizing? And that's not to say generally Caucasian, because we know that there are Caucasoid peoples that are not quite us, and we don't want to draw too large of a tent. But even there are people, content creators in our circles, who make videos about the Scythians as white peoples of the desert who were what up into the Russian steppes and then eventually into more European lands, and were antecedents of even Germanic peoples. So there are people who say that there were people maybe that looked like us in the Middle East, and that these traditions these peoples were actually white peoples. Is that, I've heard people say that that's loony Fed stuff. I've heard people say that that's the whole key that's been missing and hidden from us. Again, we can't get too off track here, but I can't not ask you about this. If you could please just give us brief thoughts on that.
I can't say for certain much about that. I do know a few things, though. I know that I'm not an expert. There will be certainly those who say absolutely they were not. Well, they weren't. They weren't the opposite extreme. I'll tell you that much. Right. They were. Well, it's interesting actually, because there almost certainly will have been some of them who would have been able to pass as such, to pass as white. Because, and the reason why I say that is because we know some of them are described like that. Some of them, like some of the earliest traditions about the icons of Jesus that one finds in the Orthodox tradition, all zero in on a kind of common, some fairly basic characteristics. And that's because they are derived from an oral tradition, which itself is derived from a letter which no one really knows. It can't really be verified. It can't really be proven to be a forgery either, which is supposedly a letter from a Roman eyewitness of Jesus who was writing to his superiors about what Jesus actually looked like. And in this description, he is described as having fair hair and bright skin, unusually bright skin for his, for his people, who probably would mostly have been sort of more Mediterranean-looking tanned, but certainly not anything more than that. Now, some people say, well, that's just because Jesus was divine, and sort of the shining countenance is a divine characteristic, and it always has been in the tradition. Even like some of these traditions come from Egypt, where I tell you the people, even today, you go visit the Copts, they don't look anything like that, but they venerate that because they see it as something beautiful and divine.
Right.
So it's not something that's just made up. There could be some truth to it. I don't know, and I'm not going to speculate about that really, because I don't know enough about it. But there are traditions which could suggest it, certainly.
And as you said earlier, there's still a place for people seeing themselves in these stories where, and this is the question we're about to get into more, is maybe there's too much of a false delineation. And again, I like that orthodoxy is about harmonies and not unnecessary dichotomies between what is truly religious life and what is truly cultural life. Obviously, there are overlaps, but Jason, I had sent you, I don't know if you have it on hand. I found this, and it speaks to the point we're on, where there's a small subset, very tiny community, Eastern Orthodox community in Japan. And I wouldn't think this is official iconography in a church, given what we talked about iconography. But if you see, it's a lithograph of that. There it is. Sorry, Alexander, it just has to go over your face for a second. StreamYard automatically puts it over the middle panel. But you see, that's a classic Japanese lithography kind of style. Jesus is depicted as coming from a Japanese family. And that's how those people are going to relate to God. You can't relate to an abstraction. You have to relate to particulars. When I was moved by the film Jesus of Nazareth by Franco Zeffirelli, which would play on TV at Easter time when I was a boy, I'd be very moved by this movie. It had nothing to do, like you were saying, with the passion thing. I was never into the Mel Gibson, torture porn stuff. I was moved by the idea of God joining man and what that would have entailed. And the actor Robert Powell, to me, no one can, this is just my personal opinion, but no one can hold a candle to how he portrayed Jesus. There was something absolutely haunting and transcendent about that performance. And I saw a man that looked like he could be my cousin, though. That's the thing. In Robert Powell, the English actor, I saw a man who had many of my own features. Would I have been moved by that film as a young boy, 12, 13 years old? I'd watch it again over several years when it would come on at Easter. I had kind of a run with it. And funny as it sounds, in our day of mass entertainment, a film actually was a big part of what got me more interested in religious life. But if that actor had been portrayed by a non-white man, I think it would have been impossible. It would have been impossible for me to have that kind of feeling and connection with him and with that story. So I understand that Japanese lithograph.
Well, I would recommend another thing as well. If you ever decide to read the Bible, don't read it.
I have.
I'm just talking to the audience in general. I'm sure you have.
Yep.
I'm sure many of them have. But I'm going to tell you now, if you read it again, don't read it and think this is. I mean, I'm not trying to say that there is no historical truth in it, because I think there is. I think it describes something that's true. But it's something that's full of, especially the Old Testament, because some of it is essentially mythology, right? It's almost the epic poetry, the epic story of the origin of a people. You shouldn't read it and think, well, this is the history of a people from thousands of years ago. Why is this relevant to me? Because it's not. If you read it like that, it really isn't. But how is it relevant to you? Well, many of the Fathers' Council, and this is why the Orthodox often read the Bible with the advice and with the Orthodox Fathers open with them, or with notes from them, is because the Fathers draw out truths relevant to us from the stories of the Old Testament, for example. So you see the people in the Exodus coming out of Egypt. Well, this is the story of anyone who has, in a sense, if you've ever been caught up if you're imprisoned to sin, if you have a habitual sin that you are struggling with, and you don't even have to be a Christian to be struggling with something habitual which really gets you, in a bad place spiritually. You're struggling with this and you feel imprisoned by it. And the salvation is to take the decision to get up and leave, and to change your life, and to struggle through the desert to get to the promised land, which is freedom from this imprisonment. Mm-hmm. Well, that essentially is the story of the Exodus, and it can be performed in each individual. It doesn't just have to be a historical story. it probably was a historical story, and there is some evidence to suggest that that this actually did happen, and I believe it happened physically. But these physical stories point towards something which is not just purely physical and is relevant to everyone.
They're types, and that's what gives any a religion its legs. It has to function on all of these different levels. I'll get to the next question, Alexander. We've already waded into this territory, so forgive me. I'm again going to read the whole question. Some of these things will be topics we've already addressed, but it'll give us a moment for full explication of this religion and culture question. So again, we're continuing on a similar line of reasoning. So how would paganism in its European forms, its various forms, how is it incomplete in your understanding? Although I will add my own little caveat here. I think a better term today for how many people actually practice it would be folkways, but I'm not a practicing pagan either. So even though I do a lot of material on European folkishness, so I can't speak as a pagan. But even so, is there a way of arguing that what many people think of as folkishness, or how they experience it through the stories and lore of legends, the symbols and crafts that have meant something to our peoples for many centuries or millennia, even ways to mark holidays of the old agricultural year, Alexander, we already spoke about dancing around the maypole, etc., is not really religion so much as it is culture. We'd like to follow that line of reasoning and see if you think Eastern Orthodoxy could contend with certain of its believers carrying on these practices simply as their culture. For it certainly would be better to have our children reading European fairy tales and dancing around the maypole than watching Netflix and dancing at nightclubs. If the gods of lore are seen as heroes or examples who offer lessons, if our ancestors are venerated but not necessarily worshipped, if we understand a warrior code alone does not a religion make, because it really doesn't. My little editorial there, but I had to get that in for all the meme lords. If our old ways are cherished but not mistaken as religious rites, I like that word cherished, different than worship, but you're still honoring something. Is there a way that a people can be folkish and Orthodox Christian? And what would orthodoxy give them? This is the key thing, I think, because we've already addressed a lot of this. What would orthodoxy give them that they wouldn't already have from such a rich, folkish lifestyle? Alexander.
I would even say, to a certain extent, orthodoxy will require you to be folkish to a degree. Now, that doesn't mean that there may be some things which would not be compatible and would have to be laid aside. But we know for a fact that this is a very healthy way to continue to actually even stoke up one's faith as an Orthodox Christian. And I say this because, again, it's documented in the writers, in the Germanic Christian writers. There is a letter recorded in Bede's history that I've mentioned before, that was written by Augustine of Canterbury, who was the Roman missionary to the people of the Anglo-Saxon people of England. When he came to convert them, he saw that they had a lot of customs. We might call them pagan customs. They weren't necessarily pagan. They were folkish customs. And he wrote to the Pope of Rome at the time, Gregory the Great, who is another Orthodox saint. And he asked essentially, what should I do? Should I get them to stop doing these things? And the Pope wrote back and he said, no, you are to take what is good and keep it and even baptize it for use in the church if you think that it would be appropriate. But if there is anything that directly contradicts the teachings of Christianity, then you must get rid of that. Which is why, for example, you find many English churches are built next to yew trees, which are very ancient trees that were Druidic sites and so on beforehand. But even aside from that, or for example, using the conversion of Anglo-Saxon pagan temples into churches.
Yeah, but there are some who'd push back and say they cut down a lot of those trees or they raised a lot of those temples. I know a pagan would push back on you with that kind of thing.
Yeah. Another thing that happened is the people themselves did that in some instances. And I'm not trying to kind of create a kind of bickering here about it. But what I will say is the history of this is the mere fact that some of these trees still survive is testament to the fact that it wasn't a universal thing. The history of this is a little hazy because, of course, although modern historians balk at the term Dark Ages, the reason why it's called that is essentially because the only people who were really taking records of this stuff were the monks. And so the history is always going to come from their perspective, really. And the pagans wrote very little down. They did write things down, but they wrote very little down. And some of the classical works of European folk literature were written by Christians. I was brought up on a lot of these fairy tales and literary works. I'm eternally grateful to my parents for reading them to me when I was young, because otherwise I had no reference point for this. I can take, for example, the story of Beowulf, which is one of my absolute favorites and remains a favorite today, is about a pagan hero, but it was written by a Christian monk, probably. It was certainly written in the Christian period in England.
But were they, just again to play devil's advocate, were they writing down something that was clearly, though, established lore that came out of the oral tradition and thus the psyche of these Germanic peoples?
What's wrong with that? What's wrong with having that psyche?
Nothing.
Wrong with having that psyche, and I think we will probably.
I was just saying it to point out that it's not an example of a necessarily a Christian, obviously not an example of a Christian moral story or worldview.
One could read, for example, for more inspiration on this, there's an Anglo-Saxon poem called "The Dream of the Rood," which is essentially written by a poet who has a dream of the cross, and he sees the cross and Christ crucified, and he recalls these various Germanic, essentially warrior codes, associating them with Christian teachings. And that's an example of what you might call folkish art and Christianity walking together very nicely. These ideas meshing together in a perfectly acceptable way. And as I say, there's certainly nothing in it which is theologically wrong, and so there would be no objection to it. These, and I already mentioned things like names in Iceland, and in Iceland they follow a form of, and a kind of strange, perverse form of Protestantism today, but originally they followed a very similar kind of Christianity, and they lost none of the kind of tradition. Like there are many Icelandic people today who are still called Thor, for example, who would be called that and also be baptized. And so, I don't see why. I suppose it's a question of attitude, actually. That's what I would say. If you adopt a custom because you're going to be falling down and worshipping before Odin, then that's a problem. But if you're going to be adopting it because it's part of your nation's history, and you're going to be kind of preserving that, whilst also directing your worship and your personal religious outlook elsewhere, seeking your salvation elsewhere, I suppose you might say, then I don't see why this would be a problem. And I've not found any. In fact, one finds numerous historical examples of this being the case, that this is just what people did, and there's no objection to it. Look, for example, at the Russians, how they melded their folk traditions with their Christianity, and I'll touch more on them later when we talk about some of the other issues. But actually, there are numerous Orthodox writers now who are using the medium of the fairy tale to great effect. There's a deacon who recently wrote a work of almost like Tolkien style mythology. So it's not something that is incompatible with the religion at all.
A lot of people will say when Christianity travels around the world, it looks different in South America versus in Northern Europe, what we're talking about. And they use it as an example of, see, it can't really be universalizing, even though it's trying to flatten everything out. And what I see in Orthodoxy, the very pointed theology and worldview that talks again about this harmony of the one and the many would say that, no, that's actually exactly how it's supposed to work. And it sounds like that's what you're saying. And I know this is tricky territory because many people can kind of cherry pick and use things as they like. But I have heard the argument that whether we're talking about folkways, as we are, or whether we're talking about philosophy, which was mentioned earlier, the Christian Orthodox thinkers I've been encountering would tell you it's not as if your tradition said, oh, everything else before Jesus was 100% incorrect, and we're just going to raise everything. We're just going to drop a bomb on everything and destroy it and start fresh. They'll say, no, the truth of God is always there. And so people were able to glean truths in stories and philosophies prior. Christianity just came, and this is what the church fathers worked out, what we talked about in the beginning, came more to just complete it or show you where the blind spots were. And now you have the whole story, you have the whole picture. Whereas certain philosophies or religions or folkways maybe had this piece or that piece, but it wasn't as stable a structure as the worldview, the ethics and the metaphysics and the epistemology of Christianity. That's just my own quick thing on that, but I think we could get more into it. If you wouldn't mind, I think I should probably read this last question, and then it'll tie all this together. Because I know I had ended the last question on, well, what would Christianity give people who already have this rich folkish life? And you began to get into that. I want to hear more about salvation. And I know what people say, saved, why do I need to be saved? And kind of plays into my next question. So this is my last formal question, and it is this. So considering what is best for the psychological defense against anti-white meme pathogens and pitching orthodoxy to the contemporary white person aware of these attacks, how do you factor in Christianity's language of, for lack of a better term, lowliness? Now, some caveats. That's not to contest the basic Christian doctrine of a fall. We can grant the world and human nature is imperfect. That's also not to say Christianity in any form is only about the poor. Parables like Jesus, the loaves and fish, giving his disciples that commandment to feed the masses, and all of a sudden there was this abundant loaf and fish, can be used to demonstrate a place for abundance in the worldview. Also, I like the fact, as I said before, orthodoxy in particular presents human sin not so much as infraction, as a debt to be paid, so much as infection, as in the current world is imperfect and awaits restoration, which is what the resurrection generally set in motion and offered to all. And thus there will always be inner and outer circumstances that can lead us astray this way or that way off the path. And because of that, various of orthodoxy's religious practices continually bring us healing and keep us right on a course of seeking God, prayer, of course, being one of those, which has been one of my biggest stumbling blocks thus far. Aside from certain aesthetics feeling foreign to me, which I mentioned earlier, this is a much more important thing, is the language I consistently see in Orthodox daily prayers that I've prayed in earnest, I might add. I was a little surprised to see that even in Orthodoxy, I still encountered terms in just about every prayer telling me that I'm apparently wicked, undeserving, in need of mercy every moment of my day. I have this from a monastery, beautiful book I've been praying. I also subscribe to an email daily office and Vespers. So I have done it in earnest. I was a little surprised to see that even in Orthodoxy, oh no, I'm sorry, I said that already. I know and understand why pride is the first sin. I've tried to approach this whole venture indeed with much openness and humility, and I don't expect every prayer to be a pep talk. Still, after spending some years away from Christian practice, it's hard for me to get from the Gospels, the work of Jesus, the love I'm told about being made in the image of God, to these Christian prayers. I don't quite see how you get from one to the other. I actually largely stopped praying over this last week and returned to my own personal prayers and statements of reflection and gratitude that I've regularly been reciting in private for the past several years. So what do you make of all that? Do you share any of this concern about what such a fundamental practice as prayer can do to the psychology of many of our contemporary European peoples, or that such mimetic strands in Christianity led to our present vulnerability in the first place. We know that a lot of people make that very argument. Alexander.
So the first thing I'll say, just to bookend what we were talking about before, I'll just briefly mention that the philosopher who I mentioned I'd written my thesis on, Nikolai Berdyaev, actually said that in pagan traditions, certain things like, for example, animal sacrifice is something that essentially points towards temple worship, where they did the same thing. And we know, for example, that when the Roman Empire was in danger, in extreme circumstances, they did practice human sacrifice. And this, he suggests, points towards something true, which is that we do need a human sacrifice, the sacrifice of Christ, so that the human person can then be resurrected. So you're correct in what you said before about the idea of pagan traditions sort of having these little grains of truth that may have been derived ultimately from some initial revelation that have since been lost, and Christianity is just a kind of reorientation and filling in of the gaps. But now I'll answer your last question, which is a spiritual question. So it's going to be difficult for me to answer in a strict sense, because you have encountered these prayers in the course of trying to build a daily prayer life. And you've been trying to, now, forgive me, I should make clear, I'm not a priest. I'm not a clergyman. I'm not a spiritual father. I do not have the blessing to tell people what they should and should not do with regards to praying and so on. And so I will just present to you, essentially pass on to you what's been passed on to me, and what my take on this personally. When trying to build a personal prayer life, a prayer rule is what we would call it, a rule of prayer that guides your day. We try to use the prayers of the fathers because these prayers are essentially, they've been used by the saints who we know through certain miraculous works have got to heaven. That's the orthodox presupposition for using them. Now, if you've taken up a prayer book and you've tried to pray the morning and evening prayers from the prayer book all the way through, straight off the bat, without having really been introduced to much orthodoxy before, without really speaking, just kind of jumping in at the deep end, so to speak, and trying to do the Vespers and so on. I suppose it's a bit like what St. Paul says about milk and solid food, that one has to start with the milk and then move on to the solid food. So the prayers of the fathers are extreme, and many of these fathers whose prayers we say in the morning and evening prayer rules, the prayers of people like St. Macarius of the desert and so on, these men led very extreme lives, which seem very, even to modern Orthodox people, would seem crazy. They did things like, they felt that many of them had done terrible things. Some of them were murderers. Some of them were serial adulterers. And they went into the desert and so on, or into the monasteries, in order to live a life of repentance for these things. And they were successful, is basically the bottom line. So you might think about yourself, I haven't done anything like that, so why should I seek? Why do I need to say the same thing? And at the face value, it's a good question. Ultimately, however, this is a question of spirituality, and it's something which is very personal and individual. And an Orthodox Christian spirituality is about seeking divine grace, essentially, and reflecting upon one's faults. I'm sure you can't tell me that you've never done something which you consider to be wrong, even if you consider it to be, aside from what Christians consider to be wrong, which is a slightly stricter law than I think many people think, because this isn't some kind of Protestantism where we say Jesus has taken away all the sins, and we just need to go and say, Jesus, take away my sins, and it's all done. It's more of a struggle than that. As for the language of needing mercy and needing forgiveness and being wretched, I will say two things. First of all, especially with regard to something like the Jesus prayer, which for people who don't know is a prayer often used by monastics, but also by Orthodox lay people, which is a prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, or Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Two different forms, short form and a long form, doesn't matter which one you use. This is used regularly by Orthodox people in order to try and follow St. Paul's injunction to pray without ceasing during the day. So just to say in one's mind, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me whilst you're doing something, is a very common practice for Orthodox people. It's essentially a kind of contemplative or meditative prayer. And the idea is that eventually, if one prays it enough, it will form such a habit that the soul or the mind will just say this prayer habitually without even thinking about it, and one will attain divine grace through doing so. When we ask God, and this is not my words, by the way, these are the words of Metropolitan Callistos Ware, who's an Orthodox bishop and author of several books on Orthodoxy and a renowned theologian, who says when we ask God for mercy, we shouldn't necessarily think that we're asking him to forgive us all the time. We're not necessarily saying, God, I've done something wrong and I need you to forgive me, because we don't always need to ask that. When we ask God to have mercy on us, we are also asking him to just essentially be God to us. If we know from the Bible, as you say, that God is loving and merciful, then when we say, Lord, have mercy on me, or Lord, have mercy on us, we are essentially just saying, God, be God to me. In the simplest terms, that's essentially what it means. And but as for, and it's true, there is more extreme language than that. There are prayers which say, "I am not worthy to do this. I am wretched. I am fallen. I am not worthy to even look upon thy face," and this kind of thing. And that's what people struggle with. Part of this is simply pride. We don't want to think of ourselves as bad people or as sinners. And but what's interesting is that even the saints, some of whom were perfect, pretty much, who managed to overcome their sins, who were virtuous, still prayed this. And why did they do that? Well, essentially, they wanted to be humble. That's kind of the bottom line. But how does this figure with sort of how can we figure this with a culture, or like our background as a people, which has aspects to it like warrior culture, and when we are trying to encourage ourselves to be strong in our spirits and trying to overcome things, how can we do this and also be constantly putting ourselves down? I understand what you're saying. Well, I encourage you to look, not to imitate necessarily directly, but as an example, look to Russia and its history. Because what was interesting about Russia was throughout much of its history, primarily in the Tsarist period, because it completely lost its Christianity in the Soviet period, but this is now starting, I think, from what I've observed, to be rediscovered. Now that the Soviet persecution is over and the Russians are starting to rediscover what their Orthodox history was, it's starting to return a little bit. What happened in Russia was there was a very great culture, kind of an inward self-presentation of a humble people. So within Russia itself, the great virtues to show towards other Russians and that other Russians appreciated and the Russian peasantry appreciated was a humility of spirit, kindness to strangers, asking one another for forgiveness, being humble, looking to holy men who would wander the wilderness, and so on. But externally, and in its external presentation to the rest of the world, Russia presented itself as a country that was not to be moved, that was powerful, it was like, it was like a bear, and this kind of thing. So I think they managed it pretty well. I think they had an inward culture of essentially this sort of Christianity without compromising on the need to be essentially also a strong culture and a thriving culture. And the way in which, I apologize, but I think I'll just finish with this, which is that ultimately we have to consider religious and political questions together here. One is a religious question, one is a political question. And being an Orthodox Christian doesn't mean that we have to lay aside political questions like the need to be a good warrior in times of struggle. Even Christ himself says there is a time to take up the sword. And when we see Christian injunctions to turn the other cheek, we're mostly thinking about situations where retaliation would lead to greater sin. When there is a need to defend ourselves and to stand up for ourselves, we must do it, and the Fathers counsel us to do this. John Chrysostom says there is a time when it may even be acceptable to strike someone, for example, if it will save them, or if it will lead to your salvation somehow. So we shouldn't think that we always need to be weak, and it's not an injunction to be weak. It's an injunction to examine our consciences. Political questions like the need to wage war, for example, will still go on. We're not going to eliminate that. We're not going to eliminate it, and we should be ready to know, to discern correctly when these things need to happen. So these things are not in tension with one another, and we shouldn't feel as though because we need repentance that we also need to emasculate ourselves.
Sure, and I know there's that concept in Byzantine Empire of the symphonia, the double-headed eagle, church and state working in symphony, something I think is a very interesting topic today. Let me put a little cap on this question, and then I know we'll have some things from the chat. Let me put it to you this way, just as a little epilogue to this. And I know you don't know me, this is the first time we're speaking, but I have no issue with humility. I have no issue with the idea that things can, you heard how much I responded to the balance, that I'm always looking for harmonies, and that really spoke to me. As I said, in Orthodoxy, I see life as it is a narrow road. It is the straight and narrow, and evil is extremes. It could take you this way or that way. And you're never really perfectly on that middle, but you want to be as on that straight and narrow as you can be. I have no problem with the idea of daily prayer and meditation that would keep you in that mindset, in that state of heart. Nous, it's more than the mind, to be cleansing you and keeping you back on that track. And you would need to be in touch with a transcendent, but a personal at the same time, God, to help you with that. How about this angle, just as a quick little cap on this question? It's even not so much that the Lord have mercy. That doesn't bother me because, again, I understand sin as infection, not so much as infraction, and just keeping on that as a meditation. Some of the other languages, like wretched, is a little strong to me. But even having said that, what about what the prayers don't say? While I have you on this topic, if I'm made in the image of God, if I'm also beautiful, are there any prayers? Are there Christian prayer books that would say things? Again, I'm not looking for a new agey pep talk, but that would celebrate that, hey, I'm in this world and I'm grateful for that. Like, look at my amazing body that God gave me. I've never seen language like that. If we are made in God's image, even though we're imperfect, the world's imperfect, we need to be restored. I don't see that kind of language in Christian prayer of thank you, God, for, of course, there's thank you, God, there's gratitude to God, but my body is amazing. My health is amazing. But I don't know. I'd have to think, you have to give me a few minutes to write what I would have thought Christian prayers might have been. And again, I have a history. I was very active in the church when I was in teenage years. So it's not like I don't have precedent and understanding, not in Orthodoxy, but general Christian practice. But are there prayers like that are more celebratory of who I am? Aren't I? Isn't my soul a gift? And can I also celebrate that? Are there prayers that go in that direction?
One finds this kind of thing often in the prayers in certain sacramental prayers, baptism, for example, chrismation, so the reception of a newly baptized person or a convert into the Orthodox Church often involves prayers which involve sanctifying and giving thanks for the senses, anointing the senses, for example. So there's the sacramental element, which is much like that. I can also think of the Psalms of David, which are regularly used in the church. Some of the Psalms of David are penitential, but many of them are not. Some of them are descriptive, giving thanks for the natural world. Some of them are about the human person in the image of God. And the Psalms are just as important, I would say, as the prayers of the saints, if not more important, because, I mean, you can make of this story what you will, but there was a story of Saint Macarius of the Desert, as I say, who wrote some of these penitential prayers. Some of these prayers which come from the perspective of someone who considers himself to be very sinful. He had a vision of an angel who supposedly revealed to him that the best prayers to use are either the Jesus prayer, Lord have mercy, or the Psalms of David. So the Book of Psalms is a good place to look if you're looking for something more uplifting. And there are Psalms for many different uses. You can find lists online of different saints who recommend different Psalms for different kind of different times of different needs, I suppose is the word I'm looking for. Different blessings. And so, for example, just for sake of example, the Book of Needs of Saint Arsenios of Cappadocia is one example of a blessing psalter. There are others as well. I'll have to look them up, and you can email me if you like, and I'll try and send some to you. But that comes to my mind.
It's actually, as I asked you the question, Alexander, and I did say I was raised in the church, I did think of the Psalm. So yes, you are right. I do remember some of the Psalms, and they are more celebratory, granted. And if you saw me looking down, I'm not texting people. I actually had to communicate privately with Jason as we're running this show and things going on in the background. But I'm 100% focused on you, and this conversation has been riveting. It is exactly what I wanted. So thank you so much for the opportunity to get through this. And I hope it was a very rich experience for those listening. I think we did a heck of a lot in an hour and 45 minutes. But my friend Jason, what is going on in the community? I apologize to anyone who might have tagged me in the chat. This topic needed 100% of my attention. So I've not looked at the chat. I'll go look now and say hi to you guys and ask me any questions. You might want to re-tag me if you had a burning question to ask me. But with that, Jason, have we collected any super chats, any questions? What is going on in TV land?
We have indeed, and it's been a riveting conversation. I really appreciate Alexander coming on to share with us all the knowledge that he has about orthodoxy, and there's been some good healthy conversation for the most part in the chat about the subject matter, and so I appreciate that. Now, over on Entropy, we have 2 financial gifts. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to financially gift, you should do so now as we're getting ready to tap out for this episode. And you can do that over on Entropy. You can also do that on Cash App. Your questions should be tagged to me and or Mr. George in the live chat. I appreciate that. Or you can place them over on the question widget on Entropy. If you place them on the on DLive, it looks like, as I am not a regular user of DLive, that just like YouTube, your question will cycle off if you simply tag me in the live stream. But perhaps there are so few actual comments that it should still be visible. Otherwise, I was going to say if that chat were moving more quickly, then maybe what is the lowest? A lemon? Is that like just under a penny's worth of Leno points? That would then put it into what is called the activity feed on the backside of the dashboard, and that appears that it wouldn't go anywhere. Then I would find your question no matter what. But over there, as I'm now looking, I do see that from the last Red Squirrels, we do have 1 diamond's worth of Leno points. Thank you for those points. And but I will get back over to Entropy, where we have 2 financial gifts. The first one from our very own Tall Kevin, who asked earlier, just before the beginning of the show today, and I guess this is a little bit of experiment that we now understand. If you financially gift just prior to the show, it will indeed show up on the donations widget on Entropy. Tall Kevin writing here. Although it doesn't, I can't see the sum, so perhaps I'll have to look. Yes, perhaps I'll have to look on the backside of the dashboard to tell you all the exact sum. But he writes here a question and says, I have been in relationships with Orthodox women and attended services together. Once I took my own candles, but she found out that they were not made of pure beeswax and she was furious. Is beeswax required, Alexander?
Beeswax is traditional. If you go into a church, I think you will find that most candles are made from beeswax, and the reason for this is basically practical. It's because beeswax candles of a certain length are designed to burn down to the bottom by the end of the Orthodox liturgical service. Basically, that's the reason why. And some artificial waxes can be harder to clean than beeswax. So I've been told. I've never heard of it being required. Maybe that just depends upon where you are in the world and what jurisdiction you are with. But I've never heard of it being required. Although I would also say I've never heard of anyone bringing their own candles to church. So maybe that's what surprised me. But I don't think this is. I don't think it's anything to be worried about.
All right, that's actually interesting. I hadn't thought about the angle that the candle would be designed to burn through its entirety during the sermon. So that's fascinating. And that was, Tall Kevin was financially gifting. I did look onto the back side of the dashboard here, and it was $4. Thank you very much for that financial gift with your question, brother. We also have a financial gift from one of our dear ladies, Rum Rum, financially gifting $10 and writing here, wonderful guest and topic. A pleasure to watch, and thank you. So thank you so very much for those kind words. We have over in the question widget, we have our very own Yiz doing magnificent work for White Wellbeing every day, absolutely infused and inspired by the biospirit of the West. And she writes here, my religion is my people. If we reclaim our destiny, we will one day travel to the stars and explore the barriers of reality. If we master ourselves, we can master the entire universe. Promethean hails. And indeed, yes, thank you so much for that and that great comment. We also have Mestizo over here in the question widget, despite the overwhelming percentage of people with dark complexions. Latin America's portrayal of biblical figures have lighter features. The region has the largest diaspora of Middle Easterners. Any thoughts on that, Alexander? I know we talked a little bit about that over the course of the stream and the presentation. In some cases, people recognizing or seeing themselves to understand God through themselves as God represented as themselves, but in other cases, lighter featured individuals. Do you have anything else that you might like to add to that?
I would just add that part of the reason why iconography often depicts people in such strict terms, as I mentioned before, because we need a reminder that these were historical people of a historical ethnicity in a historical place in time. And then this can work for everyone. There are saints who are of African descent, for example. I know some African people found it very important to them when they came to Orthodoxy to find saints who were of that ethnicity. But it just as much relates to anyone else. And I think this is why the saints are important in Orthodoxy, is because we can relate to specific individuals who are from our people or similar people, wherever we are in the world.
Very well said, brother. And we have finally on the question widget, a question that I don't believe can be answered because the premises here would, of course, be rejected, but I will share it anyhow. It is from our dear friend Angharad Celtic, a regular caller on the Sunday shows. She writes, I have a question. What is the emotional need for alleged white men to push for a doctrine that obliterates white culture and mores and enslaves us to a foreign god of those that loathe us? So I imagine, Alexander, that many of the premises here are rejected, and so the question's impossible to answer. But nonetheless,
We also addressed a
Yes.
lot of that
Yes.
before.
Yeah, what I would say is I touched on some of these issues. I don't know if this question was asked before we touched on that. All I would say is this question obviously rests on certain premises which are coming from a different place to mine. I don't think that that's true. I don't think that what this person thinks will be the case will be the case, and I think there's plenty of evidence that it won't be. But one thing I'd say is don't take my word for it. Go and find out for yourself, and you might be surprised at what you find.
Well, very good and very well said. And she actually,
Hold on. Where would such a person start? Because this question, obviously, this person is very dubious, and I've been at times in my life very dubious on Christianity. I understand that. What would be a good resource?
Something like Timothy Ware's book, The Orthodox Church, would give an introduction to the history. From that, as I say, you could even read the Church Fathers. Even if you're dubious about the non-European ones, read the European ones first. You'll find that they are your friends. They're not out to get you. They're not out to make you do anything foreign. They want to help you. And many of them say, we believe in the Orthodox Church, these saints are not just people who existed who are moral exemplars. These are people who underwent the process of deification. They became united with God through their struggle. And so they're still alive in a sense. And they're looking out for you personally now. So seek their help is my advice.
Well said. Thank you very much for that. And Jared, thank you for jumping in with a request for a place that folks might be able to look to find more information on that particular question and that subject. And
that was Timothy Weir, W-E-I-R. Did I hear that correctly? W-A-R-E, Timothy Ware. Okay.
All right. Very good. Okay. Yeah, so she was in good spirits, saying that she never thought that I would actually read that question. Well, I think we handled it very well, especially Alexander. But that appears to be the end of the financial gifts and questions. Unless I have missed your question somewhere, speak up quickly. And otherwise, I will pass it over to Mr. George to see if he has any follow-up on the questions that were asked or any final thoughts or questions for Alexander, and then we can begin to tap out today's magnificent program.
Well, again, I think for under 2 hours to get through something as heavy as a religion, at least as an introduction, I'm happy with this. And Alexander, thank you again. I think it's worth investigating, especially because, as we said in the beginning, it spoke to a little bit, even though it wasn't the focus of today's show, that it would appear that the Eastern Orthodox countries on the whole are handling globalism and anti-whiteism a lot better than any of the rest. And that does bear investigation. That certainly does bear investigation. And they are maintaining their ethno-cultures, from what I understand as well. So it's in that spirit we investigate what can help us as peoples of European descent on this show. We've had all kinds of guests with all kinds of religious and philosophical backgrounds. So it's in the spirit of inquiry and hopefully humility that we present to you something that could help. And if you feel it's something to investigate, I think Alexander has given you a lot of rich material, both in what he said and what he referenced to investigate. Alexander, when you say your closing words, if you have any resources, videos, or books that you'd like to point people to that would specifically talk a little more about politically and geopolitically why those Eastern Orthodox countries are faring better, I and I'm sure some of our chat would be very curious to hear about that. But as for me, I actually started a new project recently. It is in the spirit of what I just said, the spirit of humility and learning new things and chewing things over live and on air. And that would be my new series of live streams with John Bruce Leonard of Arctos. I have to thank John, first of all, for introducing us to Alex. He helped make today's show possible. But this week, John and I started a show called Learning in Public. I host it on my channel. It's going to be in more places like podcast sites soon. But check this out. For anyone who was interested and riveted by this conversation today, John and I are going to use our next show on Monday as a follow-up to this very TAP episode. So we will continue talking about Eastern Orthodoxy because, like me, John Bruce Leonard of Arctos himself has been exploring Eastern Orthodoxy in his own private life over the last few months. So we just happened to talk more, realize we want to do this show together, but also, funny enough, had been looking into Eastern Orthodoxy separately. And now that we're doing this show together, it makes sense to speak about it, especially in light of this conversation we just had with Alex. So as a bit of a post game, please do join us if that sounds interesting to you. I think it'll be noon on Monday. I have to work out something with like the countdown links. I haven't done countdown links for counting down to the stream, like posting the stream the day before on YouTube for the first two we did this week. It's obviously I know how to do that regularly, but we're restreaming to several platforms, so it's a little more complicated, but we'll get it all up and running. The main thing is at least follow my social media, Twitter, Telegram, things like that, and you'll get the exact show announcement, the exact start time. I usually do it a day before, so in this case it would be Sunday. But as I said, it looks like it's going to be noon Eastern, which is 5 in the UK or 6 in Central Europe on Monday. Me and John Bruce Leonard learning in public, and we'll chew up a little more of our impressions from this show. John's going to watch this episode of TAP and take some of his own notes. We will sometimes have guests on that show. A lot of times we'll have guests who can maybe teach us something, and Alexander, maybe you'll come on and we'll talk more on that show as well. But that show's not necessarily guest driven. A lot of the times it's me and John and you, the chat. We consider you the third seat as we're all just kind of going over some questions and learning some new things together. So very excited about that. Some new things coming down the pike as well. As I've said, a book project looking to come out hopefully next month where Jason's actually involved, John's involved, I'm involved. We all wrote pieces, and some of your other content creators and producers you'll recognize have written some pieces in this beautiful coffee table luxury type book publication. You'll hear more about that soon. I will have original music soon and start all of that. A lot of more art and culture creation, something that I'm very passionate about, and Jason and I are both very passionate about creating and fostering. We feel very strongly about that, and we're thrilled to be just continuing in all of that. The one place for me where it all happens and is all cataloged and you can see it all and contact me and support is my site, of course, thegreatorder.com. Pretty easy to remember. So if you remember one thing, it's thegreatorder.com. But other than that, Alexander, thank you again. Thank you for all who listened. It was certainly a very edifying and interesting conversation. It was everything I hoped it would be. So I deeply thank you for that. Alexander, please share any information. And like I said, if you do have some resources on why the Eastern countries are faring better under globalism, please do share them. But if not, you can get right into your links and all of your information, your book, and where people can find you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me on. It's been a great pleasure to be here and to speak with you and to share what I know. Although I certainly don't know everything about this religion that I've been a part of for some years, and I hope it's been interesting. A brief word on what you mentioned. I think there is some truth to the fact that the Eastern European countries are faring better against modernity. It may have something to do with religion. Nothing we believe in the Orthodox Church happens without the providence of God. And I believe we're seeing something of a separation of wheat and the chaff, if you like. There's a separation geopolitically going on. Now, I don't believe necessarily that someone like Vladimir Putin is a particularly pious Orthodox Christian. I mean, he certainly is one. He certainly goes to church. I don't know to what extent that is. I don't know his heart. I don't know to what extent he really believes in it or anything. But I'm almost not interested in what is going through his mind, a similar leader's mind. Because if you look at another Orthodox country like Greece, you see it's actually quite secularized in many ways. So we must be careful to what extent we attribute the religion to political goings on.
That's the one asterisk I've heard, is that they've gotten away from a lot of the theology, and there's a lot of stuff about their leader, which some people say that's actually more of a case point that if you get away from the truth, you pay for it. But that might be a whole other episode. And I know we're waiting in a dangerous territory, getting extra time here.
at great length about, you know, not even necessarily God's vengeance. It's not even necessarily to do with that. It's to do with the fact that if you stray away from the truth, you'll do it yourself. You'll bring yourself to perdition. It's nothing to do with God. But that might be a story for another time. Russia is a unique case because, unlike Greece, it's come out of a state of great persecution, of the communist persecution. And it's still in living memory for many people. And they are aligning themselves against what they see to essentially be a reincarnation of this elsewhere. And that has a spiritual aspect. Of course it does. Communism, for all its outward atheism, was also a spiritual belief, because in denying spirituality, one adopts a spiritual belief. And so my counsel to everyone watching is, even if you don't consider yourself to be a spiritual person, even if you have no real interest in that, or you consider spirituality to be associated with your political beliefs, remember that there's always something beyond the physical, beyond the material. Because the great lie that's been propagated in recent years is that what you can observe is all there is. And the reason why I say that's a load of rubbish is because that's not, if you're interested in reviving the traditions of European people, they didn't believe that. Your forefathers didn't believe that. They had no concept of a purely scientific world. And I use this term scientific this comes with its own caveats. So I would urge you to be careful, to read up on these things, to make sure you're informed, to make sure that you consider these questions carefully, no matter what conclusion you come to, because they are important questions and you can't escape them. There are important questions about how you can justify your worldview without some kind of spiritual belief, for example. These are important things, so I'd urge you to look for yourself and don't just take my word for it. But in the meantime, I will pray for you all for what it's worth, and I will ask God to be with you, to guide you, to save you, and to grant you victory over all your enemies, physical and spiritual. And may He help you. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for that, Alexander, on all of those points. And folks, you can find down in the description Alexander's contact. You can also find the book that he authored. The links where you can find that book, though, you won't see on the YouTube description, but you will find those links on knowwhiteguilt.org, thegreatorder.com, and theafterparty.tv. Offsite links that haven't been on the channel for a year or so are used as strikes against this channel. So you won't find any new offsite links on the channel, but you will find them in those other locations. So please do follow up with Alexander, his book that he wrote, and Mr. George as well, especially with this new series of shows that he's doing with John Bruce Leonard. Very exciting. I've watched the first one and it was fantastic. Please make sure that you don't miss that. And if you are not already subscribed to Mr. George, make sure that you are. I want to give a big thanks to everybody who participated in the conversation tonight, and everybody behaving professionally and like adults, as we would expect here in service to White Wellbeing. I want to spotlight a few people that we saw in the chat tonight. I saw the wonderful Irish Rose. I also saw Popcorn Power. And who else did I see over the course of the night? I did have oh yes, it was Artist Life I saw tonight. So a big salute and spotlight for all of you. A big thank you to everybody who posed questions, and a bigger thank you to everyone who financially gifted. It is always a splendid time to meet with you all here on tap, and this was even more splendid than usual. Thank you all for being here, and we look forward to seeing you next time.